Joining me now is Ron Unz, the former publisher of the American Conservative magazine. He was at the White House today as President Obama signed the minimum wage executive order. And Ron's, I've been following very closely your campaign to sell conservatives on raising the minimum wage. Give me the elevator pitch. I'm a conservative billionaire. You and I end up at the same conference. What's your pitch for why I should be behind a minimum wage increase?
Well, it's a very simple idea. Right now, the government spends over $250 billion every year on social welfare programs for the working poor, people who work but can't afford to survive on their paychecks. If we raise the minimum wage to a reasonable level, all those costs will be cut, and the taxpayers will save money. I think it makes much more sense for businesses to pay their own workers rather than to shift the burden to the American taxpayer.
What's interesting is that we've seen a push over the years, it's almost a bipartisan push in policy to do precisely the opposite, which is basically to say, we're going to let the labor market be as it is, but we will come up with things like the earned income tax credit. We see the expansion of food stamps in order to keep people afloat at the bottom of the wage scale. You're saying that's the wrong approach.
Exactly. That's because I'm a conservative. The EITC and these other programs are essentially welfare programs. The idea is that you send checks to poor people to make them somewhat less poor. I think it makes much more sense for workers to get a reasonable paycheck so the taxpayer doesn't have to make up the difference. And what's really outrageous is that Marco Rubio and a number of other prominent Republicans are saying that the solution to America's poverty problem right now is more government welfare. That's not what the Republican Party advocated when I originally became a Republican under Ronald Reagan.
So are you getting any traction with fellow conservatives on this? Because what I've seen actually is, I think, some kind of consensus around the minimum wage, at least politically, if not ideologically, really disintegrate during this particular fight.
I think we're making a lot of progress. Take, for example, the most prominent conservative on TV, Bill O'Reilly. Just a couple of weeks ago, he endorsed the $10 an hour minimum wage that's proposed in Congress by the Democrats. Phyllis Schlafly, an iconic conservative figure, came out of a column saying exactly the same thing. We should raise the minimum wage so as to reduce social welfare spending. A prominent economic writer for National Review said exactly the same thing and endorsed the $12 an hour minimum wage that I'm proposing. A lot of the conservatives I've been talking to on talk radio and prominent figures in California, when the idea is explained to them in those terms, they suddenly see that it makes a lot of sense. So businesses should stand on their own 2 feet rather than forcing the taxpayer to make up the difference.
Explain that idea, right? Because what I think the pushback you get, particularly from the business class and particularly from the restaurant owners, who, Lord knows, they are lobbied to the hilt on this issue on Capitol Hill, is that this is big government telling people what to pay their workers.
Well, how many of those business owners are saying that we should cut social welfare spending that the taxpayer is providing? None of them. They would view that as heartless. They're willing to give away other people's money, but not their own. They should pay their own workers. And if they can't survive in a free market system, then perhaps a different business should take their place.
One of the things we've seen, actually, is that when you look at earning projections from Wall Street analysts for Walmart, for instance, things like the big $5 billion food stamp cut, the hunger cliff, which we covered on the show, shows up in what Wall Street analysts say about the profitability of Walmart, because so much of Walmart's revenue is coming from essentially food stamp money and other government subsidies to low-wage workers.
Exactly. And actually, if you take the case of Walmart, the studies that have been done show that Walmart could accommodate a $12 an hour minimum wage by simply raising their prices 1.1% one time. The average Walmart shopper would pay an extra $12 per year, and that would allow Walmart to cover the costs of an extra $12 an hour minimum wage. I think a higher minimum wage makes much more sense for America and gets us back to where we were in the late 1960s at the peak of our post-war prosperity.
You know, the irony here is I've spent a lot of time talking on this show and in other reportorial capacities to low-wage, minimum wage workers, and they make the very same conservative case you do, which is that people would rather earn a wage, a fair wage they could feed their family and pay their rent on, than get things like food stamps and the earned income tax credit.
Exactly. It's really strange today that we have the Democrats, we have President Obama saying we should make work pay more, which would automatically reduce social welfare spending because the workers are less poor. Meanwhile, it's the Republicans who say that the solution to our poverty problem is more welfare.
Yeah.
And I don't think that's a popular answer.
Well, Ron Unz, I'm going to be following this. You've got a ballot initiative you're trying to get on the ballot in 2014 in California. I'd love to have you back to talk about that. It's a great pleasure having you on.
Hey, that sounds great.